everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to another episode of Sci-Fi. Elliot, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Alfie?
I'm
Banter.
good,
Starting off with banter. We're changing it up. Casual, real casual. Like.
Before we introduce our guest, really happy to have Matthew Flisfeder with us today. Before I introduce him, I want to say that Sublation Magazine is publishing a weekly article connected to our show. So if people are listening that are, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, psychology nerds, which we know some of you are, you should also check out Sublation Mag, which we have a kind of written format, and people can also write for that and so on. So I'll put the link for that in the comments. And thanks everyone for checking that out. So really great to be joined by Matthew Flisfeder today, who's recently, I think last year or quite recently, maybe even this year, published a really important, interesting book, Algorithms of Desire, which is with Northwestern University Press, which is really about the question of how we are being transformed as subjects and how friendships, identity, relationships is being kind of radically changed and shifted by contemporary digital culture and media culture. And he's looking at that through a kind of psychoanalytic lens for the most part. He's also a professor at University of Winnipeg in the Department of Rhetoric and Communication. So, thanks for joining us, Matthew, and congratulations on a really great book.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me here. Yeah, so the book came out, it was 2021, the book came out. It's called Algorithmic Desire.
Well, tell us, from your own perspective, how this book came about for you, more in a personal way. How did you start working on this? How did you come to this topic, and sort of why psychoanalysis and the digital world of algorithms, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So, the book itself, it was a very long project, and it's a very dense book, but it's more or less a project that I started working on pretty much after my first book, which was on the work of Slavoj Žižek and film theory, which was my doctoral research. And that book came out in 2012. And around the time that I was doing that, I was thinking about how to adapt what I was doing for film theory to thinking questions about social media. And I've been an active participant on social media for decades now. So it seemed a logical shift to make. And more or less my work has not just been film and media, but popular culture more generally. So social media at the time around 2012, 2013 was really, part of the popular culture that I was interested in thinking about. And I guess part of the background too about this is that for the longest time, I've been interested and influenced in the kind of Althusserian and structuralist and semiotics branch of film and popular culture studies. So that was sort of what brought me to people like Slavoj Žižek in the Slovenian school, Alenka Zupancic, Mladen Dolar, and then some of the American fellow travelers, Hillary Neroni, Todd McGowan, Anna Kornblue, Jody Dean, and so forth. And again, right after the film theory book came out, I co-edited a book with my friend Louis Paul Willis on Žižek and media studies, and that was the first piece that I really started thinking and writing about social media, kind of in dialogue and debate with the work of Jody Dean and her conception of communicative capitalism. So from that, my work on social media kind of spiraled out, and over a number of years, I was writing pieces using Marxism psychoanalysis to write about social media, and culminated in the book. I finished the book in 2019, and then it came out in 2021.
Great. I know, it's super interesting. We had an interview recently with Jody Dean as well, actually, so people can check that out too. She's super interesting and really influential for me as well. And
I wouldn't want to debate Jody Dean. That seems like a terrifying prospect. It's like a recipe for disaster.
Jody was the critical examiner on my doctoral defense, and
right.
Parallel interpretations, but some ways very, very different interpretations of Lacan and Žižek in particular. So that was an interesting debate, and I think that our work continues to be in debate with each other.
Right. Yeah. What is? Sorry, Alfie.
No, you go ahead, Elliot. I was just going to say my doctoral examiner was Mladen Dolar, actually, so all in the same sphere. But you go ahead, Elliot, and then I'll come in and ask mine.
Yeah, my doctoral examiner was anyway. Right. So No, I'm a clinical psychotherapist, so I don't have a doctoral degree. I have a master's degree in clinical psychotherapy. Right. But I was going to ask, how is your work in conversation with Jody Dean's theory, and what sort of disagreement do you have? Do you have a disagreement with any particular point?
Right. So this is something, I mean, if people want to read it, this comes out in chapter 2 of the book. And more or less, I disagree with the way that she, drawing on the work of Zizek in particular, but I also take this up in reference to the work of Frederick Jameson and his writing of postmodernism. I disagree somewhat with the way that she has theorized the notion of the demise or the decline of symbolic efficiency. And if we get into the nitty gritty of Lacanian,
right. Well, that's like a core thing, isn't it?
Core, yeah. And where I disagree fundamentally is that for me, the problem of ideology is still one of desire, hence the title of the book, Algorithmic Desire, rather than the way that she describes it as a problem of the drive. And the way that I read Dean's work, especially her work on communicative capitalism, is the proposition from her perspective that subjects of communicative capitalism have already in some way traversed the fantasy, no longer believe in the efficacy of the symbolic order or the big other. And therefore, she disagrees, and I side more with Zizek, but she disagrees with Zizek that a left or a communist ethics is built around an ethics of the drive. Zizek theorizes the emancipatory politics as a politics of the drive, whereas for drive is what makes ideology work. And that's where I fundamentally disagree. I still believe that subjects of ideology are subjects of desire, that there is a present yet still disavowed belief in the big other. And that, for me, one of the things that we can see with social media is that the way in which the platform is functioned, particularly in the what Nick Sternsick calls the platform capitalism, still very much we can see the reconstitution of a form of the symbolic order of the big other for 21st century capitalism.
Right. The new concrete form of the platform is quite interesting. Here we have a very mini platform. Sci-fi.
Yeah, no, I think that's
if there's platform capitalism, is this like, what would you call this platform? Like anarchic mutual socialism? Or no, just subject of platform capitalism of YouTube, and Facebook, and all the rest, right? Oh yeah, go on. Sorry, Alfie.
Yeah. No, let's come into the chapter of your book, which we wanted to focus in on some part of it, and we decided to talk a little bit about this chapter that you talk about dating apps on, basically, and the chapter's called The Swiping Logic of the Signifier. But I've got quite a few questions about the book in general, but just to sort of start talking about this as a kind of, because in some ways what you're doing here is using questions of online dating as a sort of microcosm for looking at a wider algorithmic transformation, let's say, in structures of desire and what it means to be a desiring subject today. Let me ask something about this. I mean, one thing I'd like you to sort of speak about, if you can, is this question of neoliberalism here, because also there's very much a sort of Marxist drive in your book, and you're basically, if I've understood it correctly, you're talking about the binary logic of obviously wider computational culture, but in this case you sort of swipe right, swipe left, affirmation, negation, 1-0, as you put it, and how this there's a tension between this and another kind of neoliberal Californian ideology, rational choice theory, basically the idea of free choice. So you're identifying a shift or a change, maybe, or a tension in neoliberalism, where there's a move from like this idea of free open choice to this kind of binary left right 1-0 choice. So why are you like, have I understood that right, and why are you saying that, and what do you sort of think is happening there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of describing. So these are arguments that develop in the 5th and 6th chapters, of the book. So the 5th chapter deals with thinking about social media as a way to understand the ideological dimensions of neoliberal capitalism specifically. And in the 6th chapter, again, the subtitle of the book is Toward a New Structuralist Theory of Social Media. And a lot of what I do throughout the book is I'm trying to redeploy a conception of a structuralism that's influenced by the Slovenian school in particular, which as opposed to the French structuralism is you can think about a structure as a closed totality that then interpolates subjects out of the structure. That subjects, as Althusser might put it, is a function of ideology, whereas for the Slovenian school, their approach to a kind of a structuralism, and here I'm drawing somewhat on the responses from Bruno Bastiles, talks about a new doctrine of structural causality, where subject is not a product of ideology, but subject is what emerges when ideology fails. So in that 6th chapter on the swiping logic, on the binary logic, one of the things I'm trying to do is to return to the older structuralist debates around binary opposition. And where I think we typically tend to think about the role of binaries, and here I'm drawing a little bit on the work of Alexander Galloway in his book on Laruelle, the one and the zero, where he talks about, I think typically we think about binaries as a opposition between a one and a two, or opposition between two positive terms. And the way that I'm trying to rethink a new structuralism based on the influence of the Slovenian school, where subject represents a gap or a lack or something missing within the structure, is to think about the binary opposition in terms of a dialectic of an affirmation and a negation. So in the swiping logic of dating apps like Tinder, where you swipe left, swipe right, the idea that I'm trying to propose here is that there's this continuous binary logic of opposition, but it's an opposition of an affirmation and a negation as opposed to an opposition between two affirmative points. Now, part of the argument that I want to make here too is that when it comes to questions of choice, we tend to think that, we make the choice and, then we move on. I mean, the typical image I might have is, the Sartrean notion of the voluntarist free choice, the early Sartre of being.
As an American, I'm extremely free because I can swipe left and right and choose Burger King and McDonald's. This is my understanding.
But what's missing, though, in that way of thinking is that with every affirmation, there's always at the same time a negation. Every choice we make is also at the same time a negation of all the other choices that we didn't choose. And I mean, in psychoanalytic terms, the way that I think about that is that every time when we talk about, in Lacanian terms, the production of the objet a as the objectification of the lack, and the way that organizes and forms into the fantasy formation, is that the fantasy is the way in which we might think, even unconsciously, about all of the various negated choices that we couldn't make when we displace the failure to get the choice that we didn't make onto some other figure. Now, one of the things that the book is also trying to do is to, in a way, it's a social media or a media studies intervention into theories of ideology or into the critique of neoliberal capitalism. So not just about how neoliberalism impacts social media, but also about how social media, we can use it as a way to understand and critique the language and the rhetoric and the discourse of neoliberalism. So in the neoliberal sense, that part of the way that we act in the society is by constantly making choices of investment into our, our human capital, right? That every choice we make, everything we spend, everything we do is an investment into the self to better represent or curate the self to the social media big other, to all the other people that we make out there. But the way in which I'm conceiving the function of the algorithm as it's been designed by platform capitalism or communicative capitalism is that in every choice that we make, we're always at the same time keeps desire at a distance from us, which functions as a lure to keep us locked in and participating on the platform. So, I mean, these are some of the different ways that I'm thinking about how social media helps us to understand, and platforms like Facebook or even Tinder are helping us to understand the way in which specifically neoliberal capitalism. And I think that, and I don't want to make the mistake of saying that, our struggle is only against neoliberalism and not capitalism generally. I do think that our struggle is against capitalism generally, but the book is looking specifically at the specific formation of particularly neoliberal capitalism in the 21st century. And I think that social media as the dominant medium of our time is something that can help us to understand the problems and the contradictions that we're faced with this formation.
Why is social media specifically not just capitalist but neoliberal? Because I'm actually taking like a bit of a sobriety on the word neoliberal, because I've just been applying it to things, and I said I'm going to try to think of other words besides neoliberal. But I feel like you will have a deeper line on this, so I am actually intrigued. Why do you call social media neoliberal capitalism?
So I think that, I don't know if I would. It's a longer conversation if I would say, to make that specific connection, social media is neoliberal capitalism. But I think that it's important to look at both the formations of capitalism historically, as well as the formations of different media historically. I think that, it's that old idea, Marx and Grundrisse said the anatomy of the human gives us indication of the anatomy of the ape. And I think that one way we can think about both different historical formations of capitalism as well as different historical formations of new media is to see how every new form tells us something about the broader historical trajectory of the various forms that came previously. So when we're talking about neoliberalism in particular, I think about it as a specific historical formation of capitalism that I still believe we're currently in. And it's a particular historical formation of capitalism. We call it neoliberalism. So I'm sure that many listeners are familiar with this history. But if you're not, when we talk about neoliberalism as the return following the somewhat collapse of the social welfare state in the late 60s, early 70s, up into the late 70s and early 80s with the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism, still following the crisis and collapse of the social welfare state, or the dominance of the social welfare state, because it still exists in different ways, in different pockets, in different places. But there's a specific political and policy shift that takes place in this moment of crisis. And the crisis of social welfare, Western states in the global north had an option, either go more towards socialism, more towards a return to a more laissez-faire type of capitalism that preceded, the Second World War and so on. And they chose the route of, forms of deregulation of the economy. And again, I draw on media scholars like Robert McChesney. This idea of deregulation is a misnomer, because there's no such thing as deregulation. We always just have regulation, but to just change the interests, that the regulation that exists at the state level is in favor of private individuals and corporations, as opposed to policy that's regulating the interests of the public. So neoliberalism for me is just a way of describing a particular historical formation, a periodization of capitalism.
That is contemporary capitalism after the 70s, so it's just specifying that of this kind of contemporary stage.
And there are, of course, there are specific ways that capitalism operates in this moment. There's a much stronger movement away from, the state as social safety net, and everybody has to there's more risk and precarity in the sense that we get access to our needs not provided by the state, but through the market, so where we act as individuals in competition with each other in the market over scarce resources, including resources like jobs, for instance. So there's a much stronger shift towards making the individual the key agent of guaranteeing needs, as well as the market as the space for getting access to needs, as opposed to provision by the state.
Sure, jobs the neoliberal aesthetic with jobs is really prevalent in terms of what you'll hear.
And that's another good
broadly,
reason,
right?
And that's another good reason why I think social media is a worthwhile medium for thinking about these problems, because so much of social media is about how we curate our individual identity, because it's a way of advertising the self in many ways as part of guaranteeing some kind of reputation or secure employment. And I think that this permeates so many fields, right? Not just with sites like LinkedIn, but the way that, Instagram right now has turned into a huge platform for selling the self, right? So you can see why this model of mediation of media is one that reflects many of the tendencies that we see in neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah, right. you just sort of came towards what I was going to ask about them, when you talk about Instagram and this kind of commodification of the self and so on. But to go back to the kind of dating sites, and this is also part of it, one of the things you're saying about, I think in this case, Tinder, is that, it's this concept of expediated, hang on, remind me, that it's the question of speed and desire and so on. You mentioned it in what you were just saying. It's kind of like this, as you said, Todd McGowan kind of position of like, capitalism needs you to be kind of unfulfilled. So in order for you to keep coming back to the app. So what ends up happening is, you're obviously these apps are not designed, the tagline of Hinge is like the app that's designed to be deleted, but you don't have to be have a PhD in media studies to realize that there'd be nothing in it for the corporation if you were to leave it, right? So you talk about accelerated intimacy and how these firms are seeking to increase productivity and profit by basically shifting how people experience each other on that. So I'd like you to sort of talk about that and how Tinder functions. And maybe you could tell us about Anna and Frank, because it's a really great chapter with this case study of presumably, a couple who met through, presumably, was it Tinder?
So there's the I draw on the Hang the DJ episode of Black Mirror, right? Where they have on that. So the title of the episode is the Smiths song. I forget the name of the actual song, but it has like Hang the DJ, right? I'm not going to do it. Right, but the idea in that, so it's a personification of a dating app, where the idea is that the app, it has something like a 98.1 success rate, and there's different simulations that are personified in the characters on the program that they go through it. But I think that one of the things that neoliberalism in particular has raised for many people is the degree of risk. We hear all that, maybe not so much these days, but, especially in the 90s, there was all the stuff about how we live in a risk society. I think today we hear much more about precarity, precarious labor, precarious lives, and so forth. And in the sense that every decision that we make, there's so much risk in failure. There's so much concern and anxiety that if we make the wrong decision, if we make, the wrong choice about, where do I go to school? Who do I marry? What kind of job do I get? All these things, if they don't pan out, then there's a lot of pressure on people to make the right choice right away. And I think it's the same thing with love relationships, the way
we must stack our skills, right?
Sorry,
we must stack. Sorry, I just said we must stack our skills and our good qualities and our curate everything.
What's the phrase? You have to build your brand, right? Everybody
build your brand.
And I don't think that it's any different in the way that people are approaching love and romance. Although I think
this is my brand.
Yeah. I think that
so far there's a hat. I haven't thought much more.
The book was written before the COVID pandemic, so I think that there are some things that might have changed and shifted with regards to the way we think about love and romance and the internet today. But I think that one of the things that dating apps, the idea is you can there's it's down to a science, right, that you can find your absolute match. And I think that that's some of the rhetoric about for liberal and capitalist discourses about the authenticity of technology, or the way that it's objective. It is an objective science that if we think algorithmically, then we're going to find or come up with the best solution, the way to behave and act, right? But there's a kind of a what's the Marcuse line about repressive desublimation, right? That there's a desublimated relationship to love and desire when there's a dimension of permissivity, right? You can do you can do what you want. You can have as much sex as you want with as many partners, hookup culture, and so on, right? But the more we're encouraged and enjoined to enjoy, right, and to go out and have fun and do all the orgy-porgy stuff, whatever we want to do, the more the actual sublimation of desire, it becomes feels more
repressive desublimation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it reminds me, I saw this to just to be, I saw someone wrote, how could you go through Freud and still be and still follow a traditional relationship and go through psychoanalysis. And that's my first thought is like, how could you go through Freud and psychoanalysis and still feel the superego imperative to enjoy, or the desublimation as the necessity, right?
No, I didn't get to it in this book, but the more I've been studying Hegel has a wonderful line on how to think about romantic love, right? And I kind of think about the, as a comparison between the dialectic of the master and slave and phenomenology of spirit versus his discussion of love in the section on family and philosophy of right, as a shift in Lacanian terms from the big other in the Lord and Bondsman to the little other, the petit a, in the love relationship. It's this idea of thinking of how Hegel describes it as a natural relation of, you fall in love with the one, you choose the one little other, right? That becomes a reflection of the negative in yourself. And it's holding on to setting your own limit in the love relationship by choosing this particular person that is going to, hold me to account or give me my limits or reflect in me back the negative, the lack that is in myself. And it's only in this way, in this kind of relationship, that we can develop some kind of freedom by setting, accepting it. I mean, there's something of the transference in that too. I mean, Dolar, Zupancic, and others describe how, for Lacan, there's something central, Bruce Fink, something central to the way in which the analytical relationship is a mirror of the love relationship. And I think, for better or worse, it's a useful way to think about how analysis can bring forth this dimension of freedom through the model of love. But I think that what platform capitalism or communicative capitalism or social media capitalism, especially on, when it comes to love and romance, the whole goal is to keep desire at a distance, right? To keep it as a lure so that you never find satisfaction and you keep yourself attached and plugged in to the platform. And they, they have to, because, their businesses and their main incentive is to collect user data as a means of procuring and increasing profits.
I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking when I was talking about the Hinge tagline. It's an oddly Lacanian logic to these apps.
Absolutely.
Well, I would even say, Alfie, with that Hinge example, the app that's designed to be deleted, it's like maybe they really even believe it, but the choice in terms of the method of desire is so baked in to app-based dating that it's designed to be deleted. But I find I can have 10 dates. Wait, why do I have to choose one of them? Maybe I'll have 10 more dates or something.
But it's such powerful rhetoric too, because it's almost like it's like taunting you. Right.
Or so I hear. This is not my experience with dating apps, for the record.
I mean, I want to talk about what we can sort of do in this situation, but also I think we should also mention the antisocial stuff. I mean, because one of the other things, not so much in that chapter on dating apps, but throughout the book, is this argument that, this is the word antisocial is particularly important for sort of embodying what it means to be a subject in digital capitalism today. So but obviously we're talking about social media, dating apps, things that, in neoliberal language around them, connect people. So why are you making this case for a kind of antisocial moment in capitalism in the age of social media, let's say?
Right. So I think that one of the common criticisms that you will hear, I mean, there's nobody that uses social media today that isn't already familiar and aware of the criticisms of social media, that we're too connected to our devices, that they give us anxiety, they give us stress. We're constantly, trying to one up. We're constantly engaged in Twitter debates and feuds and butting heads. And there's all these problems with various different actors, on the right and sometimes on the left, the alt-right, the so-called vampire castle that Mark Fisher wrote about almost a decade ago now. So I think that it's a common criticism to say that social media is making us more and more antisocial. Now, the problem that I have with that is I think that here social media stands in as a kind of displacement of the problems of capitalism, and specifically neoliberal capitalism. As I was saying before, that one of the aspects of neoliberalism is that it encourages us, it enjoins us to always think of ourselves as individuals as opposed to, say, members of society that, help each other and cooperate with each other, to think of ourselves as individuals in competition with each other. And I think that it's the specific structure of neoliberalism that is encouraging people to act in an antisocial way rather than the platform itself. I think that the platforms amplify those dimensions of an antisocial, competitive aspect of neoliberal subjectivity. But I think that they're reflecting that aspect of neoliberalism because they've been designed to do that. The way that the algorithms and the platforms are designed and written is first and foremost in the interests of platforms as businesses. And I think that they're reflecting, and again, one of the another common mistake, I think, is to just say, though, this is a Facebook problem or this is a Twitter problem. No, this is a capitalism problem. This is a neoliberalism problem. And I don't think that going after this or that platform company, just something we saw in the wake of, the Ed Snowden revelations or even the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that this is the problem with a few bad apples.
Should we leave Zuckerberg alone?
Well, I mean, I think that on the one hand, there's responsibility, for the actions of each individual partner and business, absolutely. But I don't think that the problem stops there. I don't think that we can just say, this is Zuckerberg or Bezos or whomever. Right. Yeah, right. I think these are all just personifications and articulations of a central contradiction that's always been part of capitalism as such. Right.
So ramping up efficiency and compressing and reducing my anxiety. Is that not a good thing? Why is it? Is it not good to just cut my anxiety all the time and make everything efficient and I can swipe through people until I like this or that?
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with efficiency as such, but I mean, the question comes back to, towards whose or which interests. I mean, efficient for what? Efficient for who? I mean, I don't think that
that's always my favorite question. That's the one that gets people.
I don't think that we've seen any kind of efficiency that's helped people get, medical care, child care. I mean, making people's lives simpler and easier. I think that people's lives are becoming much more complicated and anxiety-ridden because of the efficiency models that have been produced to serve the interests of profit, ever-increasing, expanding profits out of the structural necessity of capitalism, right? It's not just that this is a moral critique of capitalism, but out of structural necessity, every firm in capitalism, due to the mechanism of competition, is required to act in this way, which is why I don't think we can just look at this or that individual or platform. I think we are looking at a structural problem. So, I mean, just going back quickly to the question of, antisocial social media or antisocial capitalism, I think that the problem is not so much with the platforms or the technology as such, but with the interests that are written into the platform. And I think that the technology itself can serve very important emancipatory functions. And that's maybe a larger conversation.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, that's going to be my next question. I mean, I just want to, slightly out of time in the conversation now, but I just wanted to go back to what Elliot said about this being a subconscious, the Lacanian logic of hinge being subconscious and so on. Like, I'm not sure about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if people in these boardrooms were reading a bit of Lacan and thinking, how can we sort of use this model to turn it into a kind of capitalist function? I'll give you an example of that seems to be obvious to me. I don't know if you have it in the US, but the lecture recording the lecture capture software that universities in the UK use is called Panopto. Now, some people were making a joke that this is a kind of odd coincidence because, of Foucault's ideas around that. But this is obviously a deliberate joke. These capitalists are winding people up by calling it Panopto because they know your Foucault types are going to be riled by this kind of, use of the word. And it's absolutely deliberate. They know exactly what they're doing. And so I just wondered what your thoughts are on do you think there's anyone out there in tech corporate boardrooms who are serving the interests of the wrong people, as you said, Matthew, who are actually reading Lacan and saying, look, this is how desire works. How can we take advantage of that? Yeah. Or do you think, the Lacanians really aren't going anything on the board?
We have... I don't know about the U.S., but I think here in Canada, we used some of my colleagues used Panopto during the pandemic for some of their lectures. But what you were saying, I mean, it reminds me of a few episodes on Mad Men where they bring in a Freudian psychoanalyst to help them. What are the best ways that we can use psychoanalysis to increase desires for, I don't know, cigarettes or whatever, right? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I've never been in the boardroom, although I'd love to be fly on the wall there. But I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, why not? I mean, why not? I mean,
there is always the perverse theorist, isn't there?
But I mean,
the perverse theorist of capital.
But I don't think that's
the world.
necessarily a problem, right? I don't think that, marketers and CEOs learning the language of psychoanalysis to do their job better is really the problem. If that's going to help them at their job, I mean, that's not.
It's a sort of capitalist realism. It's that what should be a point that undercuts the capitalist logic is then sort of converted into a useful tool for it to continue functioning and improve its functioning.
So, I mean, one of the things that you're raising that I was going to say is that, I mean, when it comes to theorists like Foucault in particular, let's say, right? I think if that model can be used against the people, I think we have to consider whether or not that's a conception that is actually emancipatory, or is it merely descriptive? Well, I mean, one of the issues that I have with somebody like Foucault is that there's nothing necessarily emancipatory about his descriptions of power and discipline. I think that it's just a description of what's taking place, of what's happening. And I think that this is something that, there's a dimension of left theory that deals in constant and absolute negation. And this is where I guess I come back to the Hegelian, the negation of the negation, that not how can we transgress limits? How can we constantly, push back or critique or move beyond limits? But how can we set up and establish limits that we choose freely that can make our society much freer? And I think that this is a debate in left discourse, but not how do we destroy structures, how do we exist in conditions of absolute structuralistness, but how can we build structures that are actually more freeing, more emancipatory? What would that require? And I think that applies to the way in which, for instance, we can think about regulation of the internet and social media. What laws can we produce? What institutions can we produce that'll actually change the purpose and the function of our media?
Yeah, I mean, let's go on to that for the last sort of 10 minutes of our chat, whatever it is, because this is what I wanted to sort of talk about. Like, what do we do, right? So, because part of your book is about showing how these trends, we started with neoliberalism, capitalism, or whatever we're going to say, how and for who do these trends serve and so on. And for the most part, they tend to serve forces that we as, I don't know whether we might be, but Lacanians, Marxists, whatever might consider a real problem. And this is the same as the sort of arguments that I'm making my own work as well. But the thing I find harder to do is think about, precisely as you said, what would this look like? Because I totally agree with you. That I'm really against the I sort of compulsion to resist the technology. I think if this technology is here to stay, whether we like it or not. Like, if we don't seize control of this kind of means of production or have a role to play as leftists, Marxists, whatever we might be, in the production of new technologies, we'll just fall behind and lose. So we do need to harness, as you said, the emancipatory power of these potential things, rather than just saying they're bad. But how?
Yeah.
And there's sort of I suppose just one last thing, two different things. Like one part of me wants to answer that question by thinking about what could we do if we had control, and another part of me wants to think, how do you actually get access to that? Because we're miles away from actually being able to use these.
Reminds me of the meme, Alfie. That's the neat part. You don't get control of it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great question. So there's a couple of things that I want to say. The first thing is that in the book, I defend sticking with the idea, the concept, or I put it the metaphor of social media. And the reason why I think we have to keep the term social media as opposed to some kind of alternative is it helps us to develop an immanent critique of the platforms that exist. Because whenever we see a problem with the existing platforms, the first thing we say is, well, that's not social media, right? When it's harming us in some way, we go back to the term itself and say, well, it's actually, it's not operating as a social media. So I think it's important to keep the term, because the term helps us to identify what is problematic, contradictory, exploitative about the platforms that exist. Now, the other thing I would say is that, and here I disagree with people like social media theorists like Christian Fuchs, for instance, where I don't think we can actually start by trying to design alternative social media or alternative platforms. I think that if, to me, these are more, libertine or libertarian types of projects to try to go, sideways off of the central platform. I don't think that we can change the conditions in which we're living simply by changing our media. Rather, I think that social media helps us to evaluate, analyze, understand the material form of the dominant ideology today. And I think that our best bet, and I say this as a socialist thinker and a socialist humanist thinker, that our best bet is to still try to occupy the center through the form of the state. I think that the main way we can change the exploitative aspects of our media is through the mechanism of the state and changes of regulation and law that have to do with the way that the media functions and operates. So I'm more big party, big state type of person here, as opposed to autonomous collectives and so on and so forth, or proposing sideways.
What could the state do besides simply what China did and ban Facebook or something like that? Is there any regulation that could stop this kind of reification of subjectivity, which is swipe subjectivity and the neoliberal and all that?
We can start with, for instance, one of the things I often think about, when we have this here in Canada, when there's, a large strike in the public sector, if there's a transit strike, for instance, there's legislated back to work type of thing because it's an essential service. If something is considered an essential service, then, like public transit, for instance, or the internet, it should be free. It should be freely available. I think that a public form of internet communication is a place to start, right?
I think that amazing. When Jeremy Corbyn suggested that over here, everyone started blowing their minds, saying the communists are going to be reading your brains through a router, but they're happy for a corporation to do it. So there's quite a challenge to get to even there, because you've got to convince people to trust the state instead of trusting platform corporations, which is the social media world we're in. But I think
a lot of people hate both. They hate the state and they hate.
This is part of the class struggle. This is the rhetorical discursive dimension of class struggle. Of course they're going to say that. You have to expect that. I think that the real task is to try to develop a discourse and a rhetoric that, that draws people's desire much more than the neoliberal mantra, right? The anti-statism, I think, is part of the dominant discourse today for both the left and the right. And I think that we have to move away from anti-statism and return to thinking about how we can make the state function as a tool, as a mechanism in the operation of universal emancipation.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah.
Right. All I can think of is the most vulgar thing, which is so the state going to delete Tinder so everybody has to date, and then we can have relationships like we
used to. Great if the state gave us, if the state invested in social and public services so that we could have more free time, so we didn't have to work our asses off because we're just getting everything in the market, and we could actually
there we go. Okay.
Bars in the street and actually, meet people IRL. Wouldn't that be great? Right?
Yeah, that would be good.
One last thing, though. I think we have to stop, reifying the state as just this big thing that's in opposition to us. I think we have to reconceive it still as a democratic space, right? That, not to be too idealistic and utopian, but people power is still something that we have to think about. Not, submitting people to the power of the state, but submitting the state to the power of the people, which is something that Marx raises in the Critique of Gotha program.
I totally agree. And it's also something that should have been made more possible by the internet. Early internet pioneers thought there was going to be a new kind of commons here, which, you could think of as a kind of strong state that answers to the people, but that age, we need to maybe resurrect that kind of age of a more hopeful attitude towards
the drive to destroy the state is so strong because the current state, does things like the Iraq War and so on. There is some enjoyment in the anti-state rhetoric that would be like a serious barrier to making anything in the state, even just listening to like music. I remember listening to like a song. It's just like, oh, this is the stupidest libertarian idea I've ever heard. The state calls it taxation, and it's theft taxation. I was like, that's so stupid. I mean, the song kind of sounds good though, you know. And I feel like this is like the big libidinal challenge, which is how do you defeat libidinally charged idiocy?
I mean,
which is
one thing maybe I'll end on here is that one area where I absolutely agree with somebody like Jody Dean is that I do believe in the function of the party of a socialist party. I don't know, again, because rhetoric and discourse is so much part of class struggle today. I don't know if it's worth using terms like socialism or communism, but I think that a party formation that is for some kind of universalist emancipation is something that has to be part of the game here. I don't think that movement politics can be part of building a large party formation, but I don't really think that they're going to advance the kind of emancipatory logic that we need in our world today. Right. So I think that this is how, and you can see the way that the right is doing so much better at combining movement and party politics globally and internationally than members of the left or socialist groups. Right. I think that they've been able to shift things so far by making their movements mean something to the big parties in different places, right? The Conservative Party, in some sense, the Liberal Party in Canada, the Republican Party in the United States.
Well, it's a much simpler idea. The conservative idea is you don't want people coming to your country, to like most simplistic, libidinally charged hatred. This is like I feel like there's a complexity problem on the left in terms of not just like, I don't mean the left's consciousnesses are too complex, as as the kind of joke goes, oh, the left meme is very long and the right meme is very quick. But it's like the idea of, this is a Hegelian idea. You need Hegel. The state has to reflect the people, which then has to reflect the interest to then create time. It is a real problem and it's worth doing, but it is this like challenge of like, how do we get there? I guess that's what we're trying to do to some extent.
Well, as Althusser said, philosophy is class struggle in theory. So I think that, there is still a dimension to the way that socialist movements and parties around the world have to construct their rhetoric to interpolate the people. Right? This is what's missing. This is what's lacking.
I agree with that. I agree with what you said, Matthew and Elliot, and I agree with Jody Dean on this point. So we all agree at the end of the show, which is what we want. It's been really, really interesting. Thanks so much for joining us on here, and thanks everyone for listening. I mean, the people should really check out the book. It's a great read. It's full of stuff we didn't get to as well. Called Algorithmic Desire, with Northwestern. And thank you, Matthew. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for listening. See you next Friday, same time and everything. Bye-bye.